เราจะมารับฟังปาฐกถาพิเศษภาคเช้าในหัวข้อประเด็นการค้าและการพัฒนาในศตวรรษที่ 21 นะครับโดยท่านดร. เอ็ดเวิร์ด Clarence-Smith ผมขออ่านประวัติท่านคร่าวๆสักเล็กน้อยดังนี้นะครับ Our next speaker who has been working with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization or UNIDO for 15 years. He is the representative and director of UNIDO's regional office for Cambodia, Laos, People's Democratic Republic, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Thailand. Prior to this posting, the speaker was the head of UNIDO's regional office for China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Mongolia, and the Republic of Korea. We're very pleased to have him here with us this morning. May I invite the speaker on stage? Please welcome Mr. Edward Clarence-Smith. ขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับ Mr. Edward นะครับ
Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the press, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here with you today, making these opening remarks at this international conference on the post-2015 development challenges, implications for trade and development in the ASEAN community. When I first saw the proposed title of my remarks, Trade and Development Issues for the 21st Century, I have to admit to having had a mild panic attack at the thought of having to consider what might happen to trade and development over the next 85 years, particularly since I personally will be lucky if I see the next 30 years. But the attack passed, and I decided to rise to the challenge. By the nature of things, my remarks will be at a relatively high level of generality and will focus on what I consider to be some of the major trends which over the coming 8 decades will impact development and by reflection trade. But I hope that my remarks will be helpful background to you all in the next 2 sessions of this conference. As a representative of the UN family, you might expect me to pass my remarks through the lens of the new Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which the world community will, with luck, adopt later this month at the UN's headquarters in New York to take the place of the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs. But even though we can expect the SDGs to guide the work of the UN for at least the next 15 years, I will not focus on them very explicitly, since they will be the topic of the next session. I will simply mention them in passing where there is a link. I will take instead my starting point, the environmental pillar of sustainability. This might strike you as surprising for a representative of an organization whose mandate hews closely to the economic pillar of sustainability. But actually, I am an environmental professional by background. Much of my career at UNIDO has focused on the environmental impact of industrialization, and this is also the focus of much of the work which UNIDO carries out in this region. But even more importantly, in the environmental field, we are facing a real existential threat to the survival of the planet. If we do not fix these problems, there will be little development and even less trade in the 21st century. Let me start with climate change, which is the subject of SDG 13. Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the UN, has said that climate change is, and I quote, the defining challenge of our era. No issue is more fundamental to the global challenges we face: reducing poverty, maintaining economic growth, and ensuring peace and stability. A few weeks ago, I attended a briefing session here in Bangkok on the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. To be frank, the report makes grim reading. We are fast approaching the possibility of living through a period where average global temperatures will rise by 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. If this indeed happens, I would expect that countries around the world will have to hunker down and prepare for the worst. We will see more and more extreme weather events and related catastrophes. We will see significant changes in patterns of rainfall and crop production. We will see rises in sea level. We will see movements of people in response to all of these changes and more. More and more of the wealth of countries, public as well as private, will have to be spent on responding to and managing all these changes and trying to minimize their impacts. This will mean that countries will have less and less money available to spend on developing themselves and ensuring an adequate quality of life for their citizens. But I am optimistic. I have to be optimistic if I'm to hope that my children can have a reasonable future. I have to believe that the world's governments will be able to act singly and collectively, sufficiently quickly and sufficiently decisively to limit average global temperature increases to within 2 degrees Celsius. This will not avoid climate change. Indeed, the climate is changing already. But it can keep the damage to within manageable proportions. Our economies should be able to continue functioning more or less correctly. Climate change is indeed a major problem, but in truth, it is only the most visible sign of a much deeper malaise within our economic systems. Very simply put, with the way our economies are designed, we consume too much of the world's resources on the one hand, and on the other, the planet's ecosystems cannot assimilate the huge quantities of waste that we generate. A measure of how much each of us uses of the Earth's resources and ecosystems is the so-called ecological footprint, which is the amount of biologically productive land and sea area necessary to supply us the resources that we consume and to assimilate the waste that we produce. To maintain a sustainable planet, each inhabitant of the Earth should, on average, keep their ecological footprint to a little under 2 hectares per person. But the average North American has an ecological footprint of just under 8 hectares per person, while the average West European has an ecological footprint of a little over, and the average Japanese a little under 5 hectares per person. This is equivalent to saying that we would need 4 planets if everyone in the world wanted to enjoy the same type of lifestyle that the average North American currently enjoys, while we would need 2.5 planets if everyone wanted to enjoy the same type of lifestyle that the average Western European or Japanese currently enjoys. I put it to you that this is exactly what our present development policies are trying to do. All the developing countries want to be like, or as rich as, or as well off as, however you want to describe it, the Americans or the Europeans or the Japanese. Well, it's simply not physically possible. We only have 1 planet, not 4, not 2.5. If, during the 21st century, the developing countries continue to adopt the patterns of consumption and production currently being used by the developed countries, and if the developed countries continue to use these same patterns of consumption and production, the world's ecosystems, its climate systems, and other systems will finally crack under the strain and collapse. And then our economies will collapse. So, what should we do? Well, one hypothetically possible option could be to freeze every country's levels of material consumption at today's levels. That would more or less keep the average global ecological footprint to an acceptable size. But this option is unacceptable. It is simply not right that the developed countries should enjoy forevermore levels of material consumption many times higher than those of the developing countries. Every country has the right to development. Every country has the right to be as developed as all other countries. Indeed, every individual in every country has a right to development. as stated in Article 22 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I quote, "Everyone is entitled to the realization through national effort and international cooperation of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality." No, the 21st century must be characterized by a steady convergence in the levels of development of all countries. Ideally, by the end of this century, all countries the world over should enjoy the same level of development. And there must be a steady convergence in the levels of development of all individuals. No one must be left behind. This is at the heart of SDG 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. So how do we square this circle? How do we ensure the same level of development for all, but with a level of material consumption that is within the carrying capacities of the one and only planet that we all share? I don't pretend to have the answer. I don't think anyone has the answer. The debates here will be at the core of the implementation of SDG 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. But let me at least give you some pointers based on the work that we have been doing at UNIDO for the last decade on green industry. First and foremost, there has to be less material flowing through our economies. One consequence for this, for the industrial sector, is that we are going to have to give much more attention to material productivity, much as the 20th century was marked by a strong focus on labor productivity, to squeeze out all the inefficiencies with which the industrial sector uses and consumes materials. UNIDO's data suggests that there are large pools of such inefficiencies in the industrial sectors of the developing countries especially. We need to make each kilo of material which industry processes and use as productive as possible. Indeed, at UNIDO, we have been doing this for the last 20 years with our sister agency, the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, through our Resource Efficiency and Cleaner Production Programme. Of course, I focus on industry, but this same rooting out of material inefficiencies should take place in all sectors of the economy. Please note, though, that greater material efficiency in and of itself will not be sufficient to maintain a healthy global ecological footprint. Because their ecological footprint is already so large, the developed countries in particular will need to reduce in absolute terms the amount of material they use, while the middle-income countries will need to focus more on remaining at current levels of material use. For instance, take Thailand. At 2.37 hectares per person, the country's ecological footprint is already somewhat above the maximum acceptable global average of 2.1. So Thailand needs to stay where it is in terms of its material use while continuing to develop. Please further note that a reduction at the global level in material use should not translate into reductions in material use in every country. The developed countries need to reduce their material use. The middle-income countries need to stabilize their levels of material use, but the other countries, particularly the least developed countries, need to increase their material consumption to be able to create the minimum economic and social benefits to which their citizens have a right. So a global reduction in material use has to be accompanied by a redistribution of that material use away from the more developed countries and towards the least developed countries. The focus of reduction should be very strongly on the virgin materials flowing through our economies. In other words, the mining or extraction of virgin materials from the Earth's crust will need to drop significantly in the 21st century. The corollary to this is that we need to redesign our economies so that they are based on circular flows of materials, what the Chinese call circular economies, where the same materials are used over and over again. Those interested in this topic can read a report by McKinsey, Europe's Circular Economy Opportunities, which just came out. It flashed on my screen this morning at breakfast. Either as a result of smaller material flows or as a mechanism by which material flows are made to become smaller, through taxes on materials, say, one would expect to see a rise in the 21st century in the cost of materials relative to other factors of production, especially the cost of labor. As a result of this, in 21st century's economies, one would expect to see relatively less material goods in circulation and more services being purchased. In other words, consumers should be purchasing fewer goods and instead should be purchasing more the services which are provided by those same goods, by leasing them. Just to give you an example of what I mean, take automobiles. Instead of every household owning one or more cars, they should purchase mobility services. We should see more car sharing schemes where you rent a car for just the few hours that you need it, more longer-term hiring of cars, more use of taxis and public transportation, and of course more use of other forms of mobility, bicycles, which can also be part of sharing schemes, and why not, good old-fashioned walking to deal with that other big problem of our age, obesity. This same concept of leasing goods rather than purchasing them can be used in industry. There are schemes already afoot where, for instance, a company which uses solvents for metal cleaning, say, will hire those solvents from the producer, who will take them back when they are spent and clean them up for reuse. In the 21st century, we would also want to see another exceedingly important shift. We need to make our products last longer. Actually, here we will be going back to the future. My grandparents would have been shocked by the throwaway society that we have become. To them, the goods that they owned deserved far greater respect and care than we give them. They would repair their goods when they broke and keep using them, whereas we just throw them away and buy another one, hopefully with a few more gadgets or apps on it. As a reflection of these different attitudes, manufacturers in the past were proud to make goods that lasted a long time, whereas many of today's manufacturers deliberately design their products so that they break down quickly, encouraging the consumer to purchase the newer model. Planned obsolescence is the term for this. This is partly a cultural phenomenon, a way for individuals to show to themselves and to the rest of the world that they are no longer poor. But it is also partly because, with labor being so expensive relative to materials, it is cheaper to throw away and buy new than to repair. This is not helped by the fact that modern product design makes it very difficult to repair many goods. Creating a healthy maintenance and repair sector in our economies will, among other things, expand services at the expense of goods. There is already movement in this direction. A number of companies, especially manufacturers of photocopiers and similar office equipment, now have programs in place where, first of all, they lease their products and do not sell them. Secondly, because they are leased, they will take them back when the consumer wants or needs to change. They will refurbish them and then put them back on the market with the same guarantees as a completely new machine. Thus, they are extending the useful life of these products. There are also a number of new companies springing up in the developed countries, many of them social enterprises, which are offering repair services for a whole array of domestic products. Again, this extends the useful life of our products. Another aspect of this is the spread of second-hand shops, which allow products to have a second life. Of course, here we have to battle against a cultural barrier, which suggests that buying second-hand is shameful. It means that you are poor. Embedded in my last 2 points are two quite revolutionary concepts. Both have to do with ownership of goods. The first is that we have to throw out the very basic assumption that most of us make, that we should own the goods, the products, the stuff that we use. Our lives are full of the stuff that we own, and we spend lots of time trying to own even more stuff. We must change this basic mindset. We have to start thinking in terms of not owning stuff, but rather of renting it when we need to use it. The second revolutionary concept is that a producer of stuff will find himself once more responsible for that stuff once it is no longer in use. At the moment, we are used to the idea that once a manufacturer sells his product to a consumer, he will no longer see it. It is the responsibility of the consumer to deal with the product once it is no longer usable. But the time is coming when producers will see their stuff coming back to them once it is disposed of by consumers, like a boomerang returning to the thrower. Indeed, that time has already come through the passage in many countries of the so-called extended producer responsibility legislation, which is being driven by waste management and disposal concerns. These two concepts tell us that producers of stuff must forget the idea that they are in business of simply selling stuff to others. They must instead start thinking of themselves as selling the services that are offered by that stuff, with the ownership of the stuff remaining with them. At this point, let me repeat myself on an exceedingly important issue. The efforts to maintain a healthy ecological footprint globally should not halt development in the developing countries, particularly in the least developed countries. No country, no individual should be left behind. As I said earlier, the 21st century must be characterized by a steady convergence in the levels of development of all countries, with the goal of having all countries enjoying the same level of development. But if the planet is to survive, this has to be a form of development based on patterns of consumption and production which are sustainable. This is at the core of SDG 8, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all, as well as SDG 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. So at this point in my remarks, let me summarize in broad terms what the world should look like by the end of the 21st century if we are to leave our children and our grandchildren a sustainable planet. Key features of national economies should be that there is less material in use in these economies, and that what material there is should be in constant reuse. This will translate into economies where there will be less stuff, less goods, less products being bought and sold. Instead, there will be more services related to those products being bought and sold. The types of materials being used in our economies should also see a shift towards less hazardous, less toxic, less eco-toxic materials. And in the case of our energy systems at least, a complete shift away from non-renewable fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. These very fundamental changes in our economies will perforce will have to be based on a tremendous burst of innovation. We will need to redesign products in every product category, from satellites to shoes, from apartment buildings to apartment furnishings. We will need to modify our production technologies so that they can reuse recycled materials rather than virgin materials. We will need to redesign how we manage products once they are no longer used. We will need to redesign our infrastructure and our living environment. By way of example, let me focus once again on climate change. If we are to have any chance of following the 2 degrees scenario, we must stop using, and therefore extracting, fossil fuels within the next 30 to 50 years. And we must replace them with sources of renewable energy. This needs not only massive investments, it also needs massive amounts of innovation. On the technologies which capture most efficiently the very local forms of renewable energy that are available to us. Given the fluctuating nature of most renewable energy, on the technologies to store this captured energy efficiently, on systems to safeguard the stability of electricity grids in the face of many small generators inputting into the grid, on the production and use of various potential energy carriers, hydrogen, biofuels, and so on. Supporting countries to create the national systems to make this innovation happen is one important part of SDG 9. So where does this leave trade? As I lean over my crystal ball and try to picture what trade might look like in this 21st century world which I have described to you, I believe I see the following trends. First and foremost, I see a shift away from long-distance trade towards more regional level and even local trade. On the one hand, as our economies converge, one main reason for current long-distance trade, differences in the price of labor, will become much less significant. Put crudely, the difference in costs between making a pair of shoes in a developing country and the same pair of shoes in Europe should disappear. So one would expect us Europeans to once more produce our own shoes rather than outsourcing this task to developing countries. The other side of the cheap labor coin, the technical skills and expertise available in countries, should also see major changes. The differences in skills and expertise between countries should become much less significant as the levels of education in the developing countries rise in step with their rising incomes. Put just as crudely, the quality and price of a satellite produced in Thailand, say, should compare favorably with the quality and price of a satellite produced in the US or Europe. So one would expect countries in this region to purchase their satellites in Thailand rather than going all the way to US or Europe to purchase them. In parallel, the wholesale adoption of circular economies, where materials in an economy are constantly being reused, should lessen the importance of trade in minerals and other virgin materials. I've already mentioned that following the 2 degrees Celsius scenario to control climate change would mean halting completely the extraction of coal, oil, and natural gas. This would eliminate the global trade in those fuels, which would take quite a large chunk out of global trade. According to WTO data, in dollar terms, fuels currently account for nearly 1/5 of cross-border merchandise trade. I would also expect to see a fall-off in the trade of metal ores and minerals, and with regards to any remaining trade in these, for a shift in their destination, with them going to the less developed countries rather than to the more developed countries. I repeat, the least developed countries still need to build up their material resources. At this point, the more developed countries would be relying on the circular cycles of materials in their economies for the metals and non-metals which they continue to use. Circular economies would also tend to bring production back home. With intensive reuse of materials, the mines will now be at home, not in some far-off country. In fact, there is already a movement called urban mining, where companies look at our urban landscapes as the place to mine for metals, for instance. Kilo for kilo, a modern building has more copper in it, through the wiring and otherwise, than many a modern copper mine. With labor prices converging, it will make economic sense to have production facilities at the mine head, as it were, and these production facilities will be serving the local markets. I personally also think that the increasing adoption of extended producer responsibility legislation will encourage producers to keep their production facilities close to their customer base, to make it easier for them to collect and recycle disposed goods. So I would imagine that long-distance trading in manufactured goods will drop considerably, substituted by regional or even local trading. This would be a major change in trading patterns. According to WTO data, currently cross-border trade in manufacture accounts for 62% of all cross-border trades in merchandise. On the other hand, I would expect to see a marked increase in the trade of services. According to the same WTO data, currently cross-border trade in commercial services is only worth 1/4 of the cross-border trade in merchandise, I would expect that ratio to have flipped by the end of the 21st century. We will trade knowledge and expertise far more than we will trade stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, in all this time, I have not said a single word about education. But let me use the occasion of having shared this podium with the Minister of Education to reflect a little on the role of education in all of this. I suppose you could say that my talk up to now has focused on two of the three pillars of sustainable development, the environmental pillar and the economic pillar. I have spoken about the need to reduce the intensity with which we use materials, shall we say the tons of materials used per unit of well-being, in a rather technical and scientific way. Little, if anything, of what I have said goes to the social pillar of sustainable development. But all of the changes which I have suggested to maintain a sustainable planet imply deep changes in social attitudes, more concretely, deep changes in our attitudes to ownership of stuff. Education has always been an important mechanism for societies to teach their younger citizens the appropriate social attitudes to adopt. We need to urgently mainstream into our educational curricula the new ideas that I have been describing today. And of course, ministries of education have a key role to play in this. But it's not just our children that we have to educate. It is also us, the adults in society. SDG 4, the Sustainable Development Goal about education, rightly insists on the need to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Even more importantly, the seventh target of this goal states, among other things, by 2030, ensure all learners, and here I stress all learners, acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles. We have to teach our children new lifestyles, but we also have to understand that if we want our children to have a planet under their feet that works, then we have to change our lifestyles, and we have to change them now. With that, let me bring this intervention to a close. I think I've spoken long enough, and you've all been very patient. But let me leave you with one last thought, for which I will cycle back to where I started. As I said at the start, I am an environmental professional and have been all my working life. The working assumption for most of my career has been that business can be more or less as usual, that we can run our economies more or less as we have been doing. It's just a matter of controlling and, if necessary, reducing the most egregious of our impacts on the environment. That working assumption, ladies and gentlemen, no longer holds. Our planet is profoundly sick, and putting it back on its feet must be our priority if, as I have said several times and never tire to repeat, we want our children to have a future. Whatever development policies we choose, whatever trade policies we choose, whatever policies we choose in every field, they have to allow our planet to heal. That healing must take priority. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clarence-Smith. I would like to invite Dr. Kamalin, the Director of ITD, to come up on stage and present a token of appreciation to Mr. Edward for his kind lecture. กราบเรียนเชิญท่านดร. กมลินนะครับ So, Mr. Edward, this is your first time in Thailand?
I actually live here now. I've been here for nearly a year.
Oh, really? Wow. Well, how do you like our country?
What do I say to that? No, I'm really enjoying myself here. It's a great experience. As you said at the beginning, I came from Beijing, and as you can imagine, it's a little different living in Bangkok than it is living in Beijing.
Never been to China myself. But I hear the weather is cooler. Is that correct?
The weather is indeed cooler, and that's one thing I have to say as a European now. I miss in Bangkok. I miss the seasons. I miss a winter, a spring, a summer. I miss that part. It's in my genes, and I find it a little difficult to deal with a completely different type of climate.
I see. Like, yeah, I've been living here almost all my life, and I wish Bangkok would be just a bit cooler. That's all, and less traffic. กับเรียนเชิญท่านดร.กำมลินทร์ด้วยครับท่านดร.กำมลินทร์พินิจภูวดลนะครับท่านผอ. ITD ขึ้นมามอบของที่ระลึกครับ Just our way of saying thank you Mr. Edward for your kind supportขอบคุณมากครับและขอบคุณท่านดร.กำมลินทร์ด้วยครับขอบคุณครับ We're going to take a quick break for 5 minutes. You can bring in your coffee and biscuits to eat here in the conference halls for we have to move things a little faster. Thank you so much. ขอเชิญพักรับประทานของว่างและกาแฟ5 นาทีนะครับแล้วก็ท่านสามารถนำกาแฟและของว่างมารับประทานในห้องประชุมได้นะครับขอบคุณมากครับ Thank you